I'm Dean Song Richardson, and I want to thank all of you for coming today to this year's Robinson Lecture. And before I do the introduction of Professor Mike Klarman, I'd like to do some introductions first. So the first person that I'd like to thank, who is present here today, is Mark Robinson, who's sitting in the front row. And this lecture series is made possible by an anonymous donor who made a contribution to the law school in honor of Mark Robinson Jr. And let me just say a few words about Mark. So Mark Robinson is a senior partner at Robinson Calcagny, Inc., and the donation was made in honor of Mark's generous support of the law school. Many of you may not know this, but the reason the law school exists is in large part to the generosity of Mark Robinson, who was one of our founders. So the reason we're sitting here today is because of his incredible support of the law school. And if you get a chance, you might want to walk down the hallway to our beautiful moot court room, which is also made possible because of the generosity of Mark Robinson. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all of your support of the law school. I'd also like, yes. Then I'd also like to introduce our Chancellor, Howard Gilman, who is also present here today. And not only is he our Chancellor, but he is also an award-winning scholar with expertise in the American Constitution and the Supreme Court. He himself is the author of numerous books. Most recently, he's a co-author of a book with our former dean, Erwin Chemerinsky, that's titled Free Speech on Campus. And I just learned today at lunch that that book is available for you to listen to, right? There's actually a, so you can do that if you want, if you get tired of reading. Okay, so finally, to the main event. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Michael J. Klarman. He is one of the country's preeminent constitutional historians, and his full biography is located in the program, so I just want to mention a few highlights. So Professor Klarman is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He received his BA and his MA in political theory from the University of Pennsylvania, his JD from Stanford, and his Doctor of Philosophy in Legal History from Oxford. Now, Professor Klarman has won numerous awards for his teaching and for his scholarship, and in 2009, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Klarman's first book, titled From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, the Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equality, was published in 2004. And our Chancellor, Chancellor Gilman, was one of the first scholars to review this book, and he described it as a magisterial book that is the first great and indispensable work of American constitutional history in the 21st century. Now, Professor Klarman was awarded the Bancroft Prize in History for that book, and for those of you who don't know this, the Bancroft Prize is considered among the most prestigious awards in the field of American history. Since then, Professor Klarman has published numerous books. His most recent is The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution, and this book has been described as revelatory. So I want to end by quoting something that Chancellor Gilman wrote about Professor Klarman's first book, because it's particularly apt here. So Chancellor Gilman wrote, "This is not constitutional history for people who want to be comforted by our constitutional tradition." The same might be said about the Framers' Coup. So we are in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Klarman.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to the Dean, the Chancellor, Mr. Robinson. I want to begin by offering you warm greetings from Red Sox Nation. We hear you have a pretty good baseball team this year. We're hoping we might see you in the World Series, but at that point we'll stop wishing you well. I'm going to talk to you about a book that I published last fall. It's about the making of the United States Constitution. I'm going to start by telling you three things about why I thought it was worth writing this book. As you probably know, there's a vast amount of material already written about the Constitution. That's pretty quick. And then I'm going to tell you about three different points that are kind of the core of the book. And that usually takes me about 40 minutes, so hopefully we'll have time for questions. So be thinking of questions to ask along the way. All right, so the first point is there's some wonderful books written about parts of the story, about the Philadelphia Convention, about the ratifying contest, about the Bill of Rights, but there isn't actually one book that talks about the whole story from soup to nuts, about the flaws in the Articles of Confederation, about what was going on in the states, the conflict over economic policy, about the Philadelphia Convention, about the struggle over ratification, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, and then the Bill of Rights, which came 2 years later. So I thought it would be worthwhile, even though there's already a lot written about those different parts of the story, to try to tell the entire story between two covers. So that's the first point. Second point is I've tried to tell the story to the extent possible through the voices of the participants. So I've tried to go back to the primary sources, let Madison and Washington and Hamilton speak for themselves. I think there are two reasons why that's an attractive thing to do. One is I think it adds a certain verve to the story, and the other is it allows people to form their own judgments about whether my interpretations are persuasive. I'm giving you the evidence there. I'm quoting from Madison or Hamilton or whatever. Then the third point is I've tried to add a sharper edge to an interpretation that's been around for a long time and that I basically agree with. So I'm not claiming any originality for this particular interpretation. That interpretation is that the Constitution is a conservative counter-revolution against the forces of democracy and redistribution that were set in motion or accelerated by the Revolutionary War. I agree with that, but as I'll explain as I go along, I'm trying to put what I call a sharper edge on that interpretation. All right, so now I'm going to talk about three different points in the book. The first point actually has two subparts because we lawyers love to add subparts. I'm going to tell you two ways in which I think the Constitution was very different from what most Americans anticipated and probably wanted from the Philadelphia Convention. The first way is that it was much more nationalizing, by which I mean simply shifting power from the state and local level to the national level. And the second is that it was anti-populist or democracy constraining. And I'm going to use those as synonyms, and maybe this is more surprising to people. A large part of the enterprise of the Philadelphia Convention was trying to create a national government that would be relatively insulated from direct populist control. All right, so that's the first point. Second point is, why did the Philadelphia Convention do those things? The Philadelphia Convention, as I've said, was not entirely representative of the country. People were surprised and perhaps not fully on board with this. So why was the Philadelphia Convention not more representative of opinion in the country? And then third, and I think most interestingly to me, how in the world did they get the country to ratify this thing that was different from what most people expected and was different in a very specific way? It was aimed at insulating the national government from direct populist influence. Why would people approve such a document, especially in what was a fairly democratic ratifying process? Now, I immediately have to qualify that. From our perspective today, it's not very democratic. Women were not participating. Most African Americans were enslaved. Even those who were free were not participating in politics. Every state had some form of property qualification, so people who owned no property were not participating. Doesn't sound very democratic to us, but if you think in terms of world history and in terms of the international context, this is probably the most democratic enterprise that the world had ever seen. Literally hundreds of thousands of Americans are participating in elections to choose a couple of thousand, maybe 1,500 delegates who are going to express a verdict on the Constitution. The world had never seen that sort of mass political participation on something like this. So again, the question is, the third question, the puzzle, why would the country in a reasonably democratic process approve this thing, part of which was addressed toward curbing democracy at the national level? Okay. So briefly describe the nationalizing features of the Constitution. First of all, the national government gets almost unlimited authority to raise taxes. Now, that's only impressive if you compare it to the baseline which existed before the Constitution. That's the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no taxing power. All it could do was issue requisitions for funds. Requisitions were basically requests. Congress would issue requests to the states for funds, and the states would comply or not as they felt appropriate, and there was no coercion mechanism. So you're moving from a system in which there was really no genuine coercive taxing power. Now, there's actually another point in the spectrum, because under the Articles, amendments had been proposed to give Congress a very limited taxing power, the power to impose import duties. But those amendments had been rejected. So you're moving from no taxing power to proposals for a very limited taxing power that were rejected to a virtually unlimited taxing power. That includes the authority, most importantly, to impose direct taxes, for example, taxes on land, taxes on people. Those were seen at the time, and probably are still seen today, as the most onerous forms of taxation because you can't escape them. Import duties are consumption taxes. In a sense, they're voluntary. If you don't want to pay them, you don't import the goods. They were mostly imposed on luxury items, so they were progressive taxes. They're collected at the port of entry. Nobody's going house to house knocking on your door to force you to pay. In comparison, real estate taxes, the collector is coming to your house. They might ask to come into your house if it's a head tax to see how many people live in the house. You can't escape those taxes, and if you can't pay, you lose your farm. So the federal government is getting the authority to impose those sorts of taxes. That was incredibly controversial, but the Constitution provides for that. Second, Constitution gives Congress virtually unlimited military authority. Congress can raise an army, Congress can create a navy, Congress can conscript state militias into federal service. Again, the relevant baseline, the Articles, Congress had no power to create a military other than to requisition troops, which is just like requisitioning money. The states might decide to cough up the troops or they might not, and Congress had no authority to coerce them. Now, proposals were made by opponents of the Constitution. If you're going to give Congress the authority to create an army, and of course you need an army to defend yourself against invasion, maybe we should at least limit it to a wartime army and not allow a peacetime army, because a peacetime army is potentially very dangerous. The government might use it not to resist an invasion, but to suppress political dissidents. Or if you're going to allow a peacetime army, maybe you should limit the number of troops. Or maybe you should require that Congress vote by supermajorities. So if you're going to have a peacetime army, you're really sure that most people want it. Those proposals were made by opponents of the Constitution. Nothing like that got into the Constitution. It's unlimited authority, virtually unlimited authority to create a national military and even conscript state militias into federal service. Third, Constitution gives Congress unlimited authority to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. There was nothing like that under the Articles of Confederation. Fourth, the Constitution gives Congress implied powers. Under the Articles, Congress was explicitly limited to expressly delegated powers. They ruled out implied powers. Under the Constitution, there's a necessary and proper clause. So in addition to each of its enumerated powers, the power to declare war, the power to coin money, Congress also has the power to pass laws that are necessary and proper for putting the other powers into operation. That is an explicit grant of implied powers. That was very controversial during the ratifying contest. It was virtually unanimously agreed to at the Philadelphia Convention. Fifth, and finally along this dimension, the Constitution supplies a mechanism for enforcing federal supremacy. That had been lacking under the Articles. So, for example, even if the Confederation Congress was given an explicit power, like the power to negotiate treaties, it had no way of making those treaties effective against the states. So if a particular state didn't like particular provisions in a treaty, the state would just laugh them off and say, we're not going to comply with that. They needed to fix that. Madison had his own idea about how to fix that. Madison's solution was the federal government should be given an unlimited power to veto any legislation passed by the states. Now, that's an extraordinary grant of power. As you may be aware, even today, nothing like that exists, even though we have a vastly more powerful national government than anyone could have anticipated at the time of the framing. But that proposal was too nationalist, even for this fairly nationalist group of delegates. So what they did was they replaced that with a three-part system of federal supremacy. First, the Constitution explicitly provides for federal supremacy. Article 6, Clause 2 says that federal law in any of its permutations, the Constitution, statute, or treaty, is superior to state law, supreme over state law, anything in state law to the contrary notwithstanding. So that's a clear theoretical statement of federal supremacy. In order to make that practically effective, the Constitution creates or authorizes a federal court system. There were no federal courts of general jurisdiction under the Articles. The Constitution creates a Supreme Court, and it authorizes but does not oblige Congress to create a lower federal court system. The third part of this system for creating federal supremacy was actually a specific rule of substantive federal law that appears in Article 1, Section 10. That provision says no state shall, among other things, make anything but gold or silver legal tender, emit bills of credit, or interfere with the obligation of contract. Now, those were addressed toward a very specific problem that existed in the mid-1780s. During an era of severe economic contraction, the state governments had been passing paper money laws and debtor relief laws to bail out farmers who were losing their farms to foreclosure because they couldn't pay their taxes. The farmers thought this was a sensible relaxation of fiscal and monetary policy in economic conditions that were as dire as any in American history other than the Great Depression. Elite framers, people like Washington, Madison, and Hamilton, saw debt relief as a kind of officially sanctioned theft. Basically, you were taking property from creditors, you were redistributing it to debtors, and they thought that contravened the very purpose of government, which was to protect property rights, not to redistribute property. A majority of states had passed such debtor relief and paper money laws in the 2 or 3 years preceding the Philadelphia Convention, yet Article 1, Section 10 was unanimously agreed to at the Philadelphia Convention. So I think that right there tells you something about how the convention is not perfectly representative of opinion in the country. All right. So those are the nationalizing features of the Constitution. Let me now turn to the anti-populist features, and the one I just mentioned is obviously both. Article 1, Section 10 both shifts power to the national level, and it's anti-populist. The whole point of Article 1, Section 10 is to prevent states from passing debtor relief measures. Turning to other anti-populist measures, first we have very long terms in office, again relative to the status quo. So under the Articles of Confederation, congressional representatives served annual terms in office. Under state constitutions, the lower house of virtually every state legislature served annual terms in office. A majority of governors served annual terms in office, and a majority of the upper house of state legislatures, the majority of the inhabitants of upper houses of state legislatures also served annual terms in office. Under the Constitution, as you know, representatives get 2 years, presidents get 4 years, senators get 6 years. It's even more striking to keep in mind that most of the framers would have gone even further in extending the longevity of federal offices had it not been for their concern about whether they could get the Constitution ratified. So they provisionally had agreed in Philadelphia to 3-year terms for the House. Many delegates in Philadelphia, including Madison, wanted 9-year terms for senators. They had provisionally agreed to 7-year terms for presidents. Some of them actually wanted to go even further than that. 4 state delegations in Philadelphia, not delegates, not individual delegates, 4 state delegations agreed at one point to a lifetime tenured president. Alexander Hamilton, this is before he was a Broadway star, he wanted lifetime tenured senators and lifetime tenured presidents because he thought that was the only way you could adequately protect property rights in a representative form of government. Second, they liked indirect elections in order to remove government from direct accountability to the people. So the people would pick the House, but state legislatures chose senators. As you may know, that remained in place until 1913, all the way till 1913. The people did not vote for senators, state legislatures chose them. We changed that finally with the 17th Amendment. And presidents, and this is still true to the present day, although it doesn't work in exactly the way the framers contemplated, presidents are not directly elected. They are chosen by electors who themselves are chosen in a method specified by state legislatures. That's a kind of double insulation of the chief executive from populist influence. So the way the framers mostly anticipated this would work is state legislatures would simply choose the presidential electors who would then independently deliberate on who the president should be. Very little direct accountability. The framers distrusted the people to pick their political leaders. One of the important delegates in Philadelphia, James Wilson, a delegate from Pennsylvania, who was one of the initial justices on the Supreme Court, he actually proposed direct election of the president by the people. Most of the delegates strongly opposed that. George Mason, who was an important Virginian in Philadelphia, he's actually the author of the Virginia Bill of Rights, which became the model for other state and then the federal Bill of Rights. Mason said in Philadelphia, quote, "It would be as unnatural to refer the choice of a proper character for chief magistrate to the people as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man. Trusting the people to choose the president is like referring a choice of colors to a blind man." I think about running for state elective office sometime on that platform. Third, the framers insulated the House, which is the most politically accountable. They insulated even the House to the extent they could from direct popular accountability. First thing is they created a very small House, meaning very large constituencies, not just in terms of population, but in terms of geographic area. Now, the point of that was really twofold. One is they thought the larger the physical constituency, the larger the population of a district, the more likely you were to get the quote-unquote better sort elected to office. People of large reputations, people who are likely to be large landowners. They thought those people would be the best situated to govern the country. Second, they believed that by having a very small House with very large constituencies, you would have a lot less of a direct connection between constituents and their representatives. So there's an era of very rudimentary transportation and communication. The larger the physical constituency, the more difficult it would be for constituents to keep a close watch on their representative. Madison referred to this as a representative refining and enlarging the views of their constituents, but a critic, a cynic might say this is a formula for representatives ignoring their views of constituents. The first House was going to have 65 members. Compare that to the lower house of the Massachusetts legislature, which had well over 300 representatives. 65 for the entire country as compared to 300 or more just for the lower house of one state. Second, the Constitution actually authorizes Congress to require the states, when they elect representatives to the House, to do so from what are known as at-large districts. So think of an example. Virginia was by far the largest, the most wealthy, the most powerful state. Virginia was going to have 10 of the representatives in the first Congress of 65 representatives. Now, we would think of that as Virginia is going to be broken up into 10 geographic districts. But Article 1, Section 4 allows Congress to superintend the time, place, and manner of federal elections. The framers contemplated that Congress would say to Virginia, you need to elect all 10 representatives at large, meaning they would represent the entire state. All Virginians would get 10 votes, and then they would select from a list, but each of the delegates would represent the entire state, turning it into a gigantic constituency. Again, the idea was the larger the physical constituency, the larger the population, the more likely you'd get the better sort elected, and the more both physical and metaphorical distance there would be between constituents and representatives. Final point about the House, the Constitution omits provision for instruction, recall, and mandatory rotation in office. Now, I'll explain those in a second, but I just want to emphasize, under the Articles of Confederation and under many state constitutions, these structural provisions were provided for. They were deliberately omitted from the Constitution. Instruction means, for example, it's just like it sounds, a New England town meeting could instruct its state representatives on how to vote on substantive issues like raising taxes, declaring independence from Great Britain. If a representative ignored instructions, that person would be morally bound to resign their office. Recall means even during your elected term in office, you can be recalled by your constituents at any time if they don't like the job you're doing. And mandatory rotation is what we think of as term limits. The idea was people who hold government office tend to get entrenched in power. One way to prevent that is to make sure that after a certain number of terms, they rotate out of office. Under the Articles, you could serve 3 annual terms, but after that, you were rotated out for the next 3 years. Under the Constitution, there is no provision for mandatory rotation. You can be elected senator for life, you can be elected president for life. Critics of the Constitution were very unhappy about that absence of mandatory rotation. So what was the purpose of these provisions? I've described democracy constraining provisions like long terms in office, indirect elections, and I've mentioned the omission of democracy enhancing provisions like instruction, recall, mandatory rotation. The point of those provisions was twofold. One, you create a federal government that is more insulated from populist political pressure than the state constitutions, and you create a national government that if the states ever do violate Article 1, Section 10 and pass debtor relief laws, the federal government will put a stop to it. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk. Second, how did the Philadelphia Convention write this thing that was so different from what most people were expecting and probably wanting? One leading contemporary critic of the Constitution said, and I think this is an accurate observation, quote, the democratic and aristocratic parts of the community were disproportionately represented in Philadelphia. Why? Why is the elite, why are the aristocrats more present in Philadelphia than they had been, for example, in state legislatures? Here are several discrete points that I hope add up to an explanation. When I said earlier that I was trying to put a sharper edge on the traditional interpretation, this is where I see myself hopefully making a contribution, because I don't think previous historians have zeroed in on these questions that are most interesting to me. A, how did the Philadelphia Convention do this thing so different from what people wanted? And B, how did they get the country to ratify something that was so different from what people expected or wanted? Okay, so I'm going to give you 5 or 6 different discrete points that I hope might add up to an explanation. First point. How did the delegates get to Philadelphia? Well, in every state but one, they were chosen by state legislatures. In South Carolina, it was the governor. Everywhere else, it was the state legislature. One state didn't send delegates. Rhode Island did not participate in the Philadelphia Convention. How did the legislatures choose the delegates? Well, in most of the states, it seems like what they did is simply pick the people of the largest reputation. So in Virginia, who did they choose? They sent George Washington. They designated Patrick Henry, who didn't go. I'll explain more about that in a minute. They picked George Mason, James Madison. They seem to have picked the people who would represent the state best, meaning their most famous, most eminent citizens. Now, those people, I would suggest to you, were more likely than not to be fairly nationalist and anti-populist in their orientation. In order to have a large reputation, a national reputation, you were likely to have served in the Confederation Congress and or served in the Revolutionary Army. Turns out a majority of delegates in Philadelphia had served in both capacities. They'd been both in the Confederation Congress and the Revolutionary Army. Those are both nationalizing experiences. Serving in the Confederation Congress inclines you to think nationally rather than parochially. Serving in the Revolutionary Army, which of course was trying to create a nation, is a profoundly nationalizing experience. Now, there's also a correlation between having a large reputation and having relatively anti-populist views. Those with a large reputation were likely to be large landowners, fairly well educated, fairly affluent, and those characteristics correlated fairly strongly with having skeptical views about too much democracy. So simply by virtue of choosing their most eminent citizens, there was probably a kind of bias in the pool toward nationalist and anti-populist views. Second, opponents of this plan, opponents who did not want a profoundly nationalizing, democracy-constraining national government, they actually had no reason to mobilize in advance because they had no idea what would happen in the Philadelphia Convention. It turns out that the agenda of the convention mostly existed in the mind of one man, James Madison. And that's not because Madison was the most accomplished, most eminent person. He was actually pretty young. He was 35 years old. He was not a commanding presence like George Washington. He was actually pretty small. He was kind of sickly. He often didn't speak loud enough for the reporter to hear what was being said when he was speaking in a conference where there was somebody taking down notes. Madison was effective for two reasons. One is he was always the best prepared man in the room, and the other was, I guess this is related, he was the one person who had actually done a study of ancient and modern confederacies. He looked at state constitutions, and he tried to come up with a diagnosis of what the problems were and come up with a set of proposals to remedy those deficiencies. So Madison spent months before the Philadelphia Convention thinking through the problems with the state constitutions and the articles and coming up with a solution. He then organized the Virginia delegates to show up early in Philadelphia so they could coordinate among themselves. In Philadelphia, they found the Pennsylvania delegates, all of whom conveniently lived in Philadelphia. So these two largest state delegations were coordinating among themselves on a very nationalist, anti-populist set of proposals to introduce to the convention. Now, it's worth pointing out Madison didn't win on a lot of things he cared about. Madison actually was depressed after the convention. You can see this in his letters, especially to Jefferson, who's off in Paris representing the country. Madison was depressed because he didn't think the convention had moved far enough in a nationalist and anti-populist direction. But of course, where you end up is profoundly influenced by where you start, and they started with the Virginia plan proposed by Madison, who was profoundly committed to a nationalizing anti-populist agenda. Third, some appointed delegates, about 8 or 10 of them, like Patrick Henry, like Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, like Samuel Chase of Maryland, about 8 or 10 delegates had been appointed by their state legislatures, didn't go to the convention, and then became leading opponents of ratification. We call them anti-federalists. Now the question is, why didn't these people go? If there were 8 or 10 of them and they'd all gone, that would have significantly changed the dynamics in Philadelphia. At one point or another, there were 55 delegates in Philadelphia, but they were never all there at the same time. And by the time the convention ended, there were only 39 of them voting in favor of the Constitution. So 8 or 10 delegates who might have opposed their plan is actually a big deal. Why didn't they go? Well, we don't have a lot of evidence. With some of them, we have a statement explaining why they didn't go, and with some of them, we have no explanation. Even with the ones who explained, there's reason to take that explanation with a grain of salt. Somebody might have said, I'm not going because I'm ill, I'm not going because I can't afford time away from my farm, but they might have said those things for other reasons. So we can speculate, and I want to admit this is speculation, and it's a very small sample size, so it's always dangerous to generalize. But I think it's plausible, I won't say probable, plausible, that some of these people, like Patrick Henry, didn't go to Philadelphia because what they thought would happen there was a mildly nationalizing scheme. Give Congress taxing power, give Congress commerce power. They didn't dream that what would happen in Philadelphia would be a radical reform initiative that they would strongly oppose. If they knew that was what's going to happen, they might have been motivated to go to fight it. Fourth, there were a few delegates like Robert Yates and John Lansing of New York, Luther Martin of Maryland, who went to Philadelphia strongly disapproved of the nationalizing and anti-populist agenda, but then chose to leave early. They basically made a choice that they would try to delegitimize the convention by walking out and not participating anymore after they saw the direction the convention was headed. Now, that's always a dubious choice, and you can see that happening all the time in politics still today. If there's something going on that you think's illegitimate, you can participate and try to push it in the direction you favor, or you can boycott it and try to undermine its legitimacy. They chose to boycott, and in retrospect, that possibly was a mistake. Two more points. The delegates made the critical decision to close the doors of the Philadelphia Convention. That was important, I think, in two different ways. One is it liberated people to make extreme nationalist and anti-populist views heard. If there were reporters in the galleries, it would have been dangerous to one's political career to have openly advocated some of the positions that people were advocating. Hamilton could never have given his speech in which he advocated lifetime tenure for senators and presidents had he known there were reporters there writing down what was being said. That would have been political suicide. The other way in which this mattered is closing the doors of the convention meant that opponents of what was happening there didn't know what was going on. The convention met for roughly 4 months. When the Constitution was unveiled on September 17th, that's the first time that the anti-federalists, the critics of the Constitution, knew what was in it. Now, in this era of very primitive transportation and communication, it took a long time to mobilize one's supporters. And as I'm going to suggest in a couple minutes, it actually took the anti-federalists longer to mobilize their supporters than the federalists. So depriving them of a 4 months head start in getting around to organizing opposition, that was probably pretty costly. Last point, the delegates made a fairly momentous choice that they were going to go for broke. Madison and Washington were exchanging correspondence before the convention, and they were pleased to discover that they agreed with each other that what they should pursue was not temporizing expedients, that's the language I believe Washington used, but rather radical reform. This is what Edmund Randolph said when he introduced the Virginia Plan. Randolph is the governor of Virginia. Once George Washington was made president of the convention, which everybody agreed to by acclamation on day one, Randolph became the most senior Virginian. So he introduces the Virginia Plan, even though it's mostly Madison's handiwork. According to Madison's notes, which are our best record on what happened in Philadelphia, this is what Randolph said when he introduced the Virginia Plan. Quote, he, meaning Randolph, would not, as far as depended on him, leave anything that seemed necessary undone. The present moment is favorable and is probably the last that will offer. Hamilton said something like that. Madison said something like that. This may be our last opportunity to get the form of government that we think is necessary to solve the problems of the Confederacy. Let's not waste that opportunity. Let's go as far as we can, subject always to the practical constraint that whatever they did would have to be ratified. But let's go as far as we can in giving the country the form of government that we think is ideal. So they decided to go for it. This might be their last chance. Third part of the talk. How did they get this thing ratified if it was, as I've been arguing, very different from what most people anticipated and perhaps wanted? First point I want to make is not an explanation. I'll give you a couple of them in a minute. I just want to emphasize how contingent the outcome is. Historians always have a problem in storytelling because they know the outcome of the story. And when you know the outcome of the story, it's very tempting to look into the past and trace the outcome as if it was inevitable. So, for example, it's hard for us to imagine the Civil War coming out the other way, but the best histories of the Civil War emphasize how contingent the outcome was. Any one of 4 different battles could have come out the other way, and the North might have lost the will to fight, in which case the United States would have broken into separate confederacies. Same thing's true about the Constitution. The Constitution is so constitutive of our identity as Americans that we have a hard time imagining imagining a world without the Constitution, but it turns out that the Constitution almost failed of ratification. So 2 states initially rejected ratification, North Carolina and Rhode Island. New Hampshire probably would have rejected ratification, but the Federalists, the supporters of ratification, deftly adjourned the convention when they realized they might lose if a vote was taken. In 3 of the 5 largest states, in addition to this point I just made, that in 3 states they either rejected or were close to rejecting, in 3 of the 5 largest states, the Constitution was ratified so narrowly that it's quite easy to imagine a different outcome. So in New York, the vote was 30-27 in favor. In Virginia, it was 89-79 in favor. And in Massachusetts, it was 187-168 in favor. Those are 3 of the 5 largest states. It's obvious the outcomes there could have been different. And even if 9 states ratified the Constitution, which would have been enough based on its own terms to go into operation, it would be very difficult to have a successful union with 1 or 2 of the largest states staying out of the union. Okay, so I'm now going to give you a few different explanations for how they were successful. The broad category for the first is the Federalists actually had built-in advantages. The Anti-Federalists did not think this was a fair fight, and in some substantial sense that was true. Second, I'm going to mention an important Anti-Federalist miscalculation. And third and finally, I'm going to talk about how the Federalists very astutely insisted that the country face an up or down vote without the ability to arrive at an intermediate solution. Most Americans probably would have preferred something between the Articles and the Constitution. The framers didn't want to give them that choice, and in the end, they didn't. They were successful at keeping that choice off the table. So Federalist advantages, and I don't want to turn this into some sort of conspiracy theory. It's not. It's just circumstances, in a sense, conspired against the Anti-Federalists, but it's not that there was some sinister Alec Jones sort of conspiracy out there that was ensuring the ratification of the Constitution. First, there was malapportionment in some state legislatures, and especially in the South Carolina ratifying convention. Sorry, I said legislatures, I mean ratifying conventions. So in South Carolina, the malapportionment was extreme. The population was moving east to west, just like in the 20th century, it was moving from farms to cities. But as population in South Carolina moved from east to west, political power was not redistributed because people are rarely altruistic in sharing political power that they already possess. So what that means is people living along the Atlantic seaboard, that's about 20% of the white population in South Carolina. 50% of the South Carolina population is enslaved, but they're not participating in politics. 20% of the population lives along the Atlantic seaboard. Those are actually the richest men in the country. Those are the large planters who, according to a kind of informal census 10 years earlier, 9 out of the 10 richest people in the country are these large rice planters along the Atlantic seaboard. It turns out there's a strong correlation generally between support for the Constitution and proximity to the Atlantic seaboard. As you move west, support for the Constitution diminishes. 20% of the population along the Atlantic seaboard elected 60% of the delegates at the South Carolina Convention. That means that in South Carolina, the ratifying convention voted 2-1 in favor of ratification, even though most historians are of the view that if you took a referendum in South Carolina, there would have been a majority opposed to ratification. Second advantage for the Federalists. Newspapers, which was the only media at the time, overwhelmingly favored ratification. 90% of Americans lived outside of cities in 1787-88, but of course, for obvious economic reasons, newspapers were published almost exclusively within cities. Now, the main economic drivers of newspapers, of course, are subscribers and advertisers. It turns out that subscribers and advertisers overwhelmingly supported ratification. ratification. Not only were cities, as I'm going to explain more in a minute, overwhelmingly supportive of ratification, but anybody involved in large-scale commerce tended to support ratification, and people who subscribed to newspapers and people who advertised in them tended to be people who were involved in commerce. Newspapers published almost exclusively Federalist essays because if they dared to publish any Federalist essays, often their subscribers and advertisers would threaten to boycott the newspapers. Anti-Federalists in some states had a hard time even getting their essays published in the newspapers. Agnes Burke, who was a leading anti-Federalist in South Carolina, complained that, quote, the whole weight and influence of the press was on the side of the Constitution. There were about 90 newspapers published in the country at that time. Only 12 of that 90 published any significant amount of anti-Federalist literature. Third, several conventions were held in eastern cities, and in cities, support for the Constitution was close to universal across class lines. So in a city like New York, 19 out of every 20 voters selecting delegates to the New York Ratifying Convention chose pro-ratification delegates, not just the bankers and lawyers and merchants, but the carpenters, the people who were blacksmiths, tavern keepers, boatmen, people who sailors on ships, they overwhelmingly supported the Constitution because, again, people who were involved in commerce, especially international trade, tended to support the Constitution. Now, why does it matter? These several conventions are being held in cities. Support for the Constitution's overwhelming in cities. That affects both opinion within the ratifying conventions and outside of the conventions. So all of the conventions were open to the public, unlike the Philadelphia Convention, which was closed. That means there are going to be people lining up to witness these spectacles standing in the galleries. In Massachusetts, 1,000 people on a cold January day are lining up to get into the church where they've moved the convention because the State House can't hold all the people who want to be there to see the proceedings. Now, if it's in a city, it's going to be almost exclusively Federalists in attendance. When an anti-Federalist delegate stands up to give a speech, that person is going to be hissed at, booed. People are going to stomp their feet. They're going to spit. They're going to disrespect these speakers. They're going to have a hard time even getting their opinions heard. Now, it also matters outside the convention. So, for example, in South Carolina, where they're meeting in Charleston, not in Columbia in the middle of the state, the planter elite are holding open houses each night after the convention delegates adjourn and they get together to drink and talk. All those planter elites support ratification, so you can be sure the delegates are only hearing favorable opinion expressed about the Constitution. Fourth point, Federalists have an advantage simply because it's easier for them to organize their supporters. People in cities support the Constitution. People along the Atlantic seaboard support the Constitution. As you move west and as you move into backcountry regions where the roads aren't very good and where there aren't very many newspapers, that's where the anti-Federalist support is greatest. In an era of very primitive transportation and communication, it's going to be much easier to rally your forces in cities and along the seaboard where you have boat transportation than in backwoods and western regions. So even if you think Federalists and anti-Federalists had roughly equal numbers of supporters, it was going to be easier for the Federalists to rally in support of the Constitution. Fifth point, the better sort, quote unquote better sort, the well-educated, relatively affluent elite overwhelmingly supported the Constitution in every state but Virginia. In Virginia, the elite was actually divided pretty much down the middle. Now, this was also an advantage in those conventions where delegates had genuinely open minds. In some conventions, that seems not to have been the case. Delegates were just there and they did whatever they had been elected to do. But in other conventions, the delegates seemed genuinely open to persuasion. Now, because the elite supported the Constitution, you've got better educated, more oratorically gifted people giving speeches in favor of the Constitution than their opponents can produce. So, for example, at the Massachusetts ratifying convention, a leading anti-federalist, Amos Singletary, complained of, quote, "these lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men that talk so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly to make us poor illiterate people swallow down the pill." Right, a kind of anti-elitist statement that resonates for us even today. The Western farmers, the debtor farmers who wanted relief from state legislatures, they think that the lawyers and bankers and merchants are trying to pull a fast one on them, that the Constitution really isn't in their interest, but these people can talk so well, they can quote Cicero in the original Latin. They're worried that they might be persuading swing delegates. Last point along this dimension is the genius of Article 7. The framers changed the rules from what everybody were expecting those rules to be. The convention that had called the Philadelphia Convention and the Confederation Congress that approved of the Philadelphia Convention had both agreed that anything that the Philadelphia Convention proposed would have to be approved by Congress and then approved by all 13 state legislatures in order to go into effect. The framers in Philadelphia wrote Article 7, which provides 9 states can put the Constitution into operation. Now, those 9 states can only bind themselves. Nobody can be bound without their consent. But if you think about it, this radically changes the position of the last holdouts. Once 9 states have ratified, the remaining 4 states, it turns out in practice, have very little choice but to go along. That's because once 9 states have approved the Constitution, you now have a new nation. If you choose not to belong to that nation, you will be denied military protection. You may be subjected to trade discrimination because you're essentially a foreign nation, and you will be cut out of all important decisions being made by the first Congress, which includes decisions like where should the national capital be situated, should we amend the Constitution with a Bill of Rights. So in practice, once 9 states ratified, the other 4 states actually had very little choice but to go along. That relates to the next point, which is anti-Federalist miscalculations, and then I have one more point and I'll be done. I think the anti-Federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, made a critical error in New York and Virginia. And it's not a crazy error, it's a plausible error. You can understand why they made it, but I think it turned out to be momentous. The Philadelphia Convention ended in September 1787. The first states to hold conventions were already convening them by November. In New York and Virginia, the legislatures decided not to hold conventions until June of 1788, 9 months after the Philadelphia Convention adjourned. The anti-federalists in those state legislatures went along with that decision. I can understand why they did it. I think probably they figured it's going to take us longer to mobilize our supporters for the reasons I just alluded to, so a late convention would actually be advantageous to us. But what they actually did was make themselves irrelevant, because by the time New York and Virginia met in June, 8 states had already ratified, and the New Hampshire adjourned convention was about to reassemble, and everybody was predicting it would be the 9th state to ratify. So, for example, the New York convention met around June 20th. By the time it finally voted, it was a month or even 5 weeks later, towards the end of July. But by then, 10 states had ratified, and New York knew it. New York had a substantial majority of anti-federalists at its convention, but they ended up going along with the Constitution, even though had their convention been several months earlier, they almost surely would have rejected ratification. All right, the last point, and maybe I'll just be very brief with this because I did want to leave time for questions. It was critical to the Federalist success to deprive the country of a choice of an intermediate option. Most Americans agreed that the Articles were badly flawed. A great many Americans thought the Constitution was also flawed. They would have preferred a Constitution that gave Congress some taxing power but not unlimited power, some military power but with restrictions. They would have preferred a Constitution where you had mandatory rotation in office for the Senate, for the President. They would have preferred a House that was 2 or 3 times the 65-person House. But the framers deftly avoided allowing that intermediate option onto the table. So let me just give you one illustration at this point and then I'll quit. Randolph, the governor of Virginia, was corresponding with Madison before the convention. Randolph said to Madison, whatever we do in Philadelphia, we should submit it to the country in a form in which the country can approve what it likes and disapprove what it doesn't like. Basically a detachable series of provisions. Madison was horrified by that suggestion, and Madison said to Randolph, there's no way you can trust the country to have an informed judgment on something as important as what the Constitution ought to look like. This is what Madison said to Jefferson later that year, 1787. Quote, in Virginia, where the mass of people have been so accustomed to be guided by their rulers on all new and intricate questions, the matter of whether to ratify the Constitution certainly surpasses the judgment of the greater part of them. All right, so to sum up, the Constitution is vastly more nationalist and more democracy constraining than most Americans anticipated and probably than most of them actually wanted. The framers took advantage of the element of surprise to get it drafted, and then, with a fair amount of luck, with some advantageous circumstances, with some miscalculations by their adversaries, they barely managed to get the country to approve it. Now, whether one agrees with that method of operation, whether one thinks it's legitimate or illegitimate, and the anti-federalists protested this is illegitimate, whether one thinks it's illegitimate or not, I think you have to step back and admire what they accomplished, because this really was, in a sense, a coup against public opinion. Not a violent coup, not a bloody coup, but in a sense they were overturning the system of government in a way that most people probably didn't wish to countenance. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say, and hopefully we have a few minutes for questions. I'd be happy to answer any. Thank you. Rich.